Blue Carbon and the Energy Economy, Coastal Strategies for Carbon Management and Resilience. If time allows, at the end of the session, I know this is the last session, but the panel will take questions by the audience. To submit a question, please scan the QR code located on the screen. Be sure to silence your cell phones. Of course, enjoy the conversation, and please join me in giving a warm welcome to our moderator, Stephen Swiber.
Thank you, everyone. I hope you can hear me okay. As you said, my name is Stephen Swiber. I am the Deputy Secretary of the Department of Energy and Natural Resources, soon to be the Department of Energy and Conservation as of October 1st of the state of Louisiana. For the previous 18 months, I've been the Energy and Environmental Policy Advisor for Governor Jeff Landry. I'm also a native of Morgan City, Louisiana, which is on the coast, which is what brings us here today. I'm also a double alum of Tulane University in political economy, 2015, Master's in Management and Energy, 2016. So I just want to say, beat Duke. They took our quarterback. So without further ado, we're joined today for a panel on blue carbon and the energy economy, coastal strategies for carbon management and resilience. And with that, I'm going to introduce the two actual subject matter experts on this. First and I'll let them introduce themselves. First, we have from LUMCON, the Louisiana University Marine Consortium.
You got it. It's right
it's
there.
Right there.
It's right there.
Oh. No, it's just consortium. The ON don't stand for anything.
Yeah.
The ON don't stand for anything. It's just the Louisiana University's Marine Consortium. Dr. Brian Roberts.
Thank you very much. The CON is that's the beginning of consortium.
I learned something from the panel already.
So thank you very much. My name is Brian Roberts. As Stephen said, I'm the executive director and chief scientist at LUMCON. I've got so my lab that I run at LUMCON is an ecosystem ecology and biogeochemistry lab. I originally come from the Northeast, but I've been down in Louisiana now for over 18 years. Started out as assistant professor and worked my way up, and now I'm the executive director and chief scientist. Myself and our team does a lot of work in this space in terms of carbon in the coastal zone, and so I think that's why I was asked to be part of this panel. That'll turn over to Gary.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Dr. Roberts. Next we'll go to Mr. Gary Clyne. He's the managing principal at CADA Energy, and I'll let you say a little bit more about yourself, Gary.
Yes, Gary Clyne, the managing principal of actually CADA is Carbon Asset Developers Associates. We call ourselves CADA Energy. We are developers. We actually restore coastlines. Right now, we're involved in projects in Africa where we are doing some work with mangroves and restoration of mangrove, bamboo, and those sort of kind of projects to get the ecosystem back on track. And we work with the oil and gas majors in order to make these projects happen. So we come from an actual boots on the ground builder standpoint.
Great. With that, I'm going to, as the person who is definitely not a subject matter expert in blue carbon, knows just enough to get into trouble, I'm going to start right there at the beginning. Gary, what is a carbon credit? What is the carbon market? And how did we get the ball rolling? How did we get to where we are today?
Well, there's different kinds of carbon markets. You have your credit system, which is where I work in, mostly international. Then you have your cap and trade systems, which you have some here in the U.S. A cap and trade system is basically within a jurisdiction where you have a rule where there's a floor and a cap that a business may, pollute. And every year, the cap goes down. So the emitting business have to find ways to reduce their emissions by improving their facilities. Basically, you're thinking about California and that sort of thing. In the international space, developers like ourselves, we build carbon reduction projects that reduce emissions, and then we sell those emission reductions to countries that need to make their commitments to the Paris Agreement, their reduction commitments. So we sell offsets, and those offsets fund our projects.
Fantastic. So that's where we started, and we're here today to talk about a specific kind of carbon credit that is a blue carbon credit. So, Dr. Roberts, why don't you tell us, why do we call it blue carbon? What is blue carbon, and how do you get a blue carbon credit?
Okay, there's a lot to that, and there's a lot of different definitions out there when we're talking about this. I mean, as Gary said, where this all originated from was the idea of having some credit to offset something else that's being done. And so people are maybe more used to thinking about this from forests, where you grow trees to basically sequester the carbon in those trees, and then that's basically carbon that's then taken out of the atmosphere. So an area that's not thought about a lot traditionally, up until the last few decades really, even more recently in terms of even the credit markets associated with that, is when we talk about our coastal habitats. Coastal habitats make up about 2% of the globe, but they account for about 50% of the carbon sequestration that happens within that coastal and ocean area. So the blue comes from ocean. We tend to think of land as green when you look at maps and you got blue as your ocean. So we're talking about blue carbon because it's associated with those marine environments. So we tend to think marine environments any place where there's a tidal influence. And so you have basically 3 categories of habitats that are considered blue carbon. So you have your mangroves, which are very tropical, but as you know, in Louisiana, they're increasingly, they're expanding their range northward as a result of changes that happen with climate. Less winter freeze allows them to expand their range. They're now actually quite prevalent in coastal Louisiana. We're limited to pretty much one species, the black mangrove here in Louisiana. But that is one of those, and globally, they're a very important habitat, and they played a big role in a lot of these projects. You also have tidal wetlands. Now that's something that we have a lot of. The state of Louisiana has about 40% of the tidal wetlands in the continental U.S. Located within our state. That tidal wetland area in Louisiana accounts for about 6 to 8% of the carbon sequestration in tidal wetlands globally. So it's a really big player in that space. The third category is one that we don't have as much of here. As you noticed, we talk about blue carbon, we're talking about ocean. Most of our coastal ocean is really brown, right? So we don't have as much in the way of seagrasses. Seagrasses is this third one of those big blue carbon habitats globally. And so I'm trying to remember what the second part of your question was. So those are basically the habitats that exist. And increasingly, what has been done is trying to come up with sort of natural climate solutions to challenges that we're having, because these habitats are being lost at alarming rates. As you know, I mean, the metric that people use all the time is that Louisiana on average loses, a football field of wetland an hour. That's averaged over a very long period of time. It's not always what the rate is, but it's a really high rate of loss. So we're losing these habitats, and it's not just limited to Louisiana. These habitats are being lost in a lot of places. And so these nature-based solutions, the idea is that if you do a restoration project that is going to create some of this habitat, that also has a lot of carbon sequestration potential associated with it. And so that's an offset of some of the pollution that happens, in industry. So if they invest in that credit, we can use those resources to restore the habitat. Now, we don't tend to think about it from the benefits of what the carbon is. We want those habitats, right? Because those habitats are the reason why we have these incredibly productive fisheries and all the recreational activities that we have associated with them. But there's a market that's starting to develop globally for this. And one of the challenges, of course, is how does things in Louisiana fit into that space? So this is something that's happened. A lot of these projects internationally, and Gary can talk probably a lot more about this than I have focused a lot on restorations with mangroves. Globally, they're really important. And there's a lot of effort to try to restore those, to try to regain some of that capability. Louisiana, we are starting to get an increasing amount of mangroves. We haven't done a lot of mangrove restoration. We've done a lot of marsh restoration and creation projects. And so the basis of a credit, is it requires two things. So there's you need to have additionality. So what do I mean by that? It means there has to be some benefit to it. So that you do this restoration project, you have to have some carbon benefit. It doesn't mean that you necessarily turn a place that's losing carbon, to the atmosphere to be one that's gaining and sequestering. If you have a high carbon release site, but you do this project and it releases less, that's additionality, right? You've improved the carbon sequestration, the net carbon sequestration of that. So the second thing is that you need feasibility, right? So this has to be something that practically can be done. You can design some project, but if you guys can't build it and implement it, then that's not something that can take place. And then the third thing is what we call permanence. So a project has to be something that is sustainable, at least on some sort of a decadal type timescale, because otherwise it's sort of this fleeting benefit, right? If you're going to build something, but it's going to erode away, within a year or two, is that really a sequestration if it's then going to be released later on? And so that's part of where that market comes into play and trying to figure out how you adapt things that are at, and maybe you can talk a little bit more about this, Gary, because I feel like I'm monopolizing right now, about the accreditation process and how that works globally. And then we can come back and talk a little bit about how it may work here in Louisiana.
Well, I think additionality is where our processes meet, because every project we undertake, we have to go through the additionality test. And additionality, as far as when you want to create a high quality offset, you got different kinds of offsets. We're talking about nature-based offsets now. They can be really tricky because sometimes it's hard to monitor and record and verify if the emission reduction actually occurred or if the avoidance of emissions actually occurred. When we look at carbon sinks, one thing that we've been really focused on lately is sargassum. It's a plague throughout the Caribbean and South America. It washes up on the beaches. It kills a lot of the tourist spots. So we've been working with technology providers. One of the things that the current administration have done that's helped us a lot is that they've dried up a lot of the R&D money. So a lot of the not-for-profit R&D mills, they need to sell their technology. So we're getting the benefit of that under master service agreements, and we're taking this best-in-class technologies from these huge 100-year-old R&D grant shops, and we're using it abroad to develop projects best in class. And it's as a developer in the UN system, we don't have a lot of competition because right now, over the past 6 months, the advantages of being a developer in the UN system has just kind of made itself obvious. With the loss of USAID, we're now doing things to help in the agricultural sector a lot, which introduce new forms of feedstocks for our biofuel lines, and as well as we look at solar and e-fuels in a different light now when it comes to moving technologies abroad. What we're doing here is more fossil fuel related because this is a fossil fuel refined crude output type of economy. And so we're on kind of both sides of that fences, and we're doing okay, and it's getting better, but we still like low emission, low, type of carbon pollution technologies which assist in the overall development of the environment. So.
Absolutely, and I as a Morgan City resident growing up, just because Brian Roberts says that we have a brown ocean and not a blue one doesn't mean that the beach still isn't fun. If you haven't been down to Grand Isle, Louisiana for a weekend, it's a very special and unique place, and one that the New York Times called one of the 50 places to go see before you die. So if you have a free day in New Orleans and you want to take a little day trip, you go down to Grand Isle, you go see Dr. Roberts and his operation over there in LUMCON down in Cocodrie, which, by the way, they have one of the best cameras to watch a storm come in. Whenever that storm surge starts rolling in, the LUMCON camera, man, you start seeing those. You look at a truck and you're like, oh, that truck's gonna go a little bit. So, but as somebody who's driven an air-cooled outboard engine through the marsh, I can tell you that it smells like methane. It smells like a carbon sink. But Brian, don't we have a coastal master plan? It's $50 billion. Do we need blue carbon to fund these projects, or do you think we're getting there with the BP money?
Well, one, the BP money is not going to last that much longer. So we're at less than 10 years left in the horizon of that initial money. And the plan was originally, implemented and designed to be about $50 billion investment over 50 years. But not all 50 million of those dollars exist, right? And as we know, the further on you go, the cost of everything goes up. So those same projects you may have designed at the beginning that would cost $50 billion, by the time you get 50 years down, going to cost well over $100 billion. So yes, we need to find ways to do this. And one of the things that when you talk to oil and gas and other industries, they are interested in these carbon markets because they can get credit to offset some of the activities that they're doing, so they can keep going with business as usual. So I think the master plan is one of the big advantages that our state has in terms of developing it. And one of the hardest parts, you talked about, making sure that people are evaluating, how much is being sequestered. We have an extensive monitoring system in this state that the rest of the world, really wants to emulate. They're jealous of it. I mean, we have our coast-wide, monitoring system. And so the coastal reference monitoring system, the CRIMS setup, which is 300 to 400 stations around our coastal wetlands that are monitored on a regular basis. So we know a lot about what's there. The modeling that we have for the coastal master plan tells us a lot about where things are, how things are being lost, where a project gets implemented, how long it lasts. So we have a lot of advantages to that. But there are some critical needs if we're going to meet some verification that's sort of a universal international type standards. I think that there's sort of 5 big things. And one, there's, legislation and policy that sort of allow you to do things the way that it needs to be done. The accreditation methodology needs to be somewhat adaptable to where you are, how you define some of these things. One of the things that's really tricky is that, okay, you build a marsh in this one location. Are you limited to seeing that carbon sequestration benefit just within those boundaries of where that project construction is? You may actually be getting that benefit downstream or upstream of it. So trying to understand where that is. We need to have better constraints on the errors in our estimates of soil carbon fluxes. Methane is really important. You brought up methane. That's the smell that we're used to kind of seeing when we go out in these wetlands. When we're talking about that permanence idea of things that are projects for multiple decades, methane becomes really important because it's such a more potent greenhouse gas in terms of the warming associated with it than carbon dioxide. So we need to take that into account. And the other is understanding lateral fluxes. Where is that carbon going? That's sort of that upstream, downstream question I had. We need to have better constraints on those. If we have a better handle on that, that allows us to have better constraints on what it means to have a credit and what it's worth. So I think those are some of the next steps that we need to do. And I think our state's doing a lot with that. I think the Coastal Master Plan, I think we've also, the CPRA has done a lot of things about having a statewide carbon working group to try to get a better handle on what our carbon stocks are and how they're changing over time and how much value added the additionality you might get from a given type of project. And ultimately, you can get to a point where if we work out some of these metrics, where that can be factored into the coastal master plan, right? So when you're evaluating whether a project gets incorporated or not, there's the possibility down the road where, what is that return, that additionality that comes from this project compared to that project in terms of carbon. We don't tend to think about it that way right now, but that's something that could happen down the road.
You see, I'm more biased as a government official, just looking at ways that we can leverage this public dollar, right, and try to get these private partners to help us, because it's true, we only have, $11 billion of coastal spending kind of identified or deployed. All in all, we're going to need help. We're going to need a lot of help. And if we can get that from completely willing participants who just want to either offset their activity or make the environment better or make the world a better place, I think that's something that's going to be a benefit to the public sector. Gary, so can you tell us a little bit more about the accreditation? Like, how does one generate a credit? I know how you generate a Bitcoin. Well, actually, I don't. I think you scream numbers into outer space and you burn a lot of power, and then some sort of archangel appears and gives you a Bitcoin or something. But how does one get a credit, and then so that they can bring that to market?
Well, I'm more familiar with the compliance market than the voluntary market, only because we actually build things and we need more gap finance to make our projects investment grade. So we work with credit systems and we work with compliance buyers. Those buyers internationally, you got Switzerland, Japan, Singapore, Norway, a number of countries, a half a dozen, that are constrained on how much they can reduce their pollution. So our company was formed in Trinidad and Tobago. In Trinidad and Tobago, we've been in oil and gas for 125 years. We know everything about oil and gas. Since Standard Oil set up its first operation in Trinidad, like I said, 125 years ago. We were one of the first companies to capture CO2 at methanol plants, at ammonia plants. We compress it, put it in a pipe, and would send it to our oil fields in the south for what we call enhanced oil recovery. For years, we sold LNG, liquid natural gas, to the United States before liquid natural gas was a thing here in the United States. But now our operations have gotten older. We use simple cycle turbines, equipment that's old, so it's leaking, and I think the owners are still the country of our Ford train. A train is I don't know how much anybody knows about LNG. It's a big thing here in the U.S. It's one of our largest exports. Liquid natural gas has what we call an end-to-end ensemble of equipment, which we call train. And from the combustion through the process to the point where you store it cryogenically for export is what we pretty much call a train. Well, we had 4 trains, and LNG is one of the biggest polluters that's out there. Not the use of the gas itself as much as the fact that the emissions are released in the air in pure form. So when you look at LNG farms, one of the best things that could happen is if during post or pre-combustion, we capture that CO2 that's released into the atmosphere and sequester it. And one of the things that we've played with time and time again internationally but could never get it done is to decouple the capture of emissions from the actual production of the energy itself, which would bring a balance to the cost matrix, and you would end up with the social cost of carbon in the end. So we are, every project that we look at basically avoids CO2 or it reduces CO2, and it requires that we build something to do it. And because that we can quantify it and we can record it, we can sell those emission reductions over the course of the life cycle of that project to a buyer internationally. So what we have, the market that we work in, is the polluter pays, more or less. So the polluting country pays us to reduce emissions because CO2 doesn't have any borders. It bleeds across. You know, if Mexico's polluting, you know, there's nothing to stop the CO2 from Mexico bleeding over to the U.S. And that's recognized, and that's the market we work in. And, you know, we apply what we've done internationally over the past 20 years to what we're now doing here in the U.S.
And I think you had mentioned that the U.S. is a little bit different in that we pay the polluters to sequester it.
Yeah, in the U.S., it's crazy. We have tax credits. You fight for the RINs, the 45Q, the 45Z, and all 48C. You got all of these different tax credits, and there are incentives to emitters not to emit, but it tends to go back and forth and change throughout the political cycle because, you know, some ideologies are for, you know, pollution and some are not. Anyway, I'm trying to figure out the best way to say this.
I've been doing that all along.
It doesn't really matter in the end if you're working with a tax credit in a democratic political system or if you're working with a tax cut in a Republican. The benefit always goes to the status quo or to the emitter. So if we're going to, you know, help the environment, we have to look at small business becoming more empowered in decoupling emission reduction science and deployment from energy delivery and generation.
And you're right. We're very voluntary. Oh, go ahead.
No. Go.
Yeah, we have a very voluntary system here in the U.S. You know, this is the system. The voluntary market is the one where Taylor Swift offsets her jet flying around by buying some carbon credits. But you know, to that point, we have a lot of companies in Louisiana who we have something called the industrial corridor, right? We have big companies who make a lot of petrochemical products for export abroad. We have a lot of companies who produce oil and gas. And I think those companies have demonstrated that they want to improve the coast that they depend on. We have a working coast here in Louisiana, and if we don't have those wetlands to stop the hurricane or abate the storm surge or the hurricanes that make landfall here, so people can't live here, then they cannot continue to do that business here. So this could be an excellent, even though it's entirely voluntary and it's entirely up to them, it could be an excellent way for them to partner with those communities to increase their long-term sustainability. Dr. Roberts, I didn't have a question.
No, that's fine. I was just, building off of both of those things. So Gary's talking a lot about where I think in the long term, if we're going to solve some of the problems that we have globally, we have to reduce the overall emissions. And so like a lot of these incentives and credits are for doing that, capturing it before it makes it up into the atmosphere. So the sorts of, you know, nature climate solutions and these blue carbon restoration projects I'm talking about is trying to find a way to sequester that carbon once it's already there, right? So that's what you're trying to do. And if you go, most people, if you ask most people what's the most productive, you know, habitat on the planet, most people are going to say rainforest, right? But they don't recognize how productive these coastal systems are. You know, these coastal blue carbon systems are as productive as any ecosystems on this planet. And so that's what you need. You need that carbon that's produced and then it gets buried. It's easy to think about the credits and the ones that are out there in sort of this carbon market, you know, people plant a tree, right, to offset, you know, their footprint. We can see that because that's the visual carbon that's above the ground. That's the easy part to see. And that's the reason why when we're talking about these tidal systems, Tidal forested wetlands is where we've made the most headway in terms of getting credits. But in these other systems, what it is, that carbon is still transient. Granted, you could have a tree that lives, a couple hundred years, and that's a pretty long sink, but eventually that tree will topple over and it'll decompose and that'll release the carbon. But where these primary producers really sequester carbon in the long term is that they bury it below ground, right? And that burial is harder to quantify. But that's really when you have that long-term sequestration happen. It's not just in the rooting zone, it's once it gets below the rooting zone, as the land accretes and gains in elevation, that stuff that gets buried below is no longer turning over and exchanging in the atmosphere. That deep carbon burial is that long-term sequestration. So, these projects are offsetting it. And so that's where, credits are certainly a viable way to move going forward. But we're also losing those habitats at an alarming rate. So, there's a lot of moving pieces in this whole scenario and trying to figure out how to do that. And that's part of the reason why, the international accreditation process for, there's different metrics that are out there, that exist. Vera is one of those that's out there. How they do that and how the standards that they use for, evaluating if this is a viable credit, maybe there's not one universal one that can be applied across the globe. You may have to think about them a little bit differently, and maybe it's a market here, if it's driven by those industries that want to do that, and because they get credit for it, it allows them to offset some of their pollution, and it has the benefit of rebuilding these habitats that we need to have this viable coastal master plan and rebuild our coast for the storm protection, for the habitats, for everything else. Maybe there's a need for a slightly different accreditation market that isn't one driven by an international body. It's something that's driven by what does the market demand locally. And some states are starting to do this. Certain different countries have their own that are not part of that same accreditation system. And that may be something that, Louisiana wants to think about moving forward.
And that's an excellent point. I mean, these environments, they have a lot of value that's not tied to the amount of carbon that might be stored in them, right? If you plant a tree in an environment that should have naturally been a prairie, maybe you're not actually doing the right thing. Gary, does sometimes the carbon market literally miss the forest for the trees?
Well, you had mentioned Taylor Swift. I go back to when Coldplay was offsetting their travel by planting trees. And some media guys called them on it, went back to, I think it was Scotland, where those trees were supposed to be, and there was no trees. So it's a lot of fraud in carbon markets. But, under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, I think it's finally wrapped up in our last conference of parties. Article 6 has 4 main parts to it. And the first Article 6.1 is cooperative endeavors, which means that any 2 countries can work together on a carbon project, which means one country can buy an offset and another country can sell it. So if you have 200 countries doing that, you will reduce. You will eventually reduce the CO2 content around the globe. When you talk about we're at 430 parts per million, when at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution we were like 220. That's an increase. And, simple third-grade science, tells you the 3 forms of matter: liquid, solid, and gas. Gas being the most volatile, the more you change it, the more things are going to change. So right now, we operate on Article 6.2. That's our space. That's where we trade at. Corresponding adjustments is what they call it in UN speak, but that's basically saying if I sell you an offset, you can't count it twice, you know. So no double counting, no carbon leakage. You know, your methodologies, your standards have to be tight. We work with the International Panel of Climate Change Scientists. We have a methodology and standard book this thick. So there's no games. We really like the biofuel space. In fact, the biofuel space where we operate now with like sustainable aviation fuel is an output. It's on the right side of the American domination, American energy domination ladder. Biofuels is right there with diesel and Jet A and unleaded gasoline and everything else. So the only difference is that that biofuels is just like, because our biofuel output is, and I'm not bragging on our company or nothing else, but it's called drop-in fuels. You know, it's the same as you can put it in your tank just like you can put unleaded gasoline. But the reason is that it's net zero is because the feedstock that we use was alive yesterday or the day before. So the thought is that that feedstock has contributed at least sucking in enough CO2 over its lifetime, so whatever it put out when it combusts in your engine is kind of like a net zero. But when you go into an oil reservoir and you start pumping oil that's hundreds of millions of years old with the carbon intensity that's really, it's so stuck, you're adding to a CO2 content, and that's the difference. So.
I've always loved the renewable, the biodiesel market, the traditional ethanol market in the U.S. because we just we mine the natural gas, then we turn it into fertilizer, then we put it on the corn, then we put the corn into the thing and make it. So I always just said that's just fossil fuels with extra steps. All right, but I'll try to keep us back to blue carbon for a minute. Brian, so before we get to questions, I want to ask the toughest question, best for last, which is. Sounds great. You know, what's standing in our way? What challenges do we need to overcome, and what does the scientific community need to do to make this a more viable option for coastal restoration?
Well, I think earlier I outlined what a number of us, at least in the scientific community, have outlined are sort of the 5 needs that we need to get better constraints on if we're going to be able to, have a viable blue carbon credit market in Louisiana. I mean, one is that we need to make sure that legislative and policies are in place that allow these things to work more easily. We need to work on what the accreditation standards are. It may not be applying those same exact metrics that exist, that are in the voluntary credit market for other places in the globe because of the fact that we have some unique aspects here. We need to have, and then when we're trying to evaluate what the benefit is, a lot of our measurements, we have really big error bars on it. It's like, yes, you have this big number, but the error bars, goes from 0 to, twice that number. So we need to have better constraints on what some of those soil carbon fluxes are. It's really hard to understand exactly how much carbon is buried deeply, and that's the long-term storage that exists. Because we want these things to be on multi-decade timescales, we spend a lot of time talking about, and most people talk about, the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. But from that warming perspective and trying to offset things, we need to do a better job of constraining what those methane fluxes are from all of these blue carbon habitats. And the last one is the lateral fluxes, that, you put a project in here, what are the fluxes in and out of that? And, where do you get credit for that? If you're sequestering stuff that came from up system of where you are, do you get credit for that, or does the system upstream get it? Or likewise, by having it here, it has a benefit for something down system. Do you get credit? Who gets credit for that? Understanding what are the magnitude of those fluxes that are moving between this footprint and that footprint are things that we need to do a better job at constraining. I think if we do those things, then we can work out what a credit system might look like, work with those industry partners, try to figure out, what is a credit? How much value is there for this credit, and this credit versus that credit, for this project, versus that project. So I think those are the 5 big ones that we need to do a better job of constraining if we're going to have these markets here. But there's obviously different opinions on that. But that's sort of where I sit right now from my perspective looking at this about where our needs are to better constrain the science for this purpose.
Fantastic. Well, time to play a game of did anyone scan the QR code? Voice in the back, do we have any questions for our panel today?
Yes, we have one. How can we best consider blue carbon and hurricanes? And a compound is how to solve for the risk that projects could be lost.
I'll go to Dr. Roberts first.
Well, I mean, that's a really good question. I mean, this speaks to that whole idea about permanence and how we define that, right? So, because hurricanes are very hard to predict where they're going to have where their impact is implemented. I think one of the ways that you deal with this is the way Louisiana is trying to approach our coasts and how we go about doing projects is to have this integrated, comprehensive master plan. And so when we're evaluating projects, you don't evaluate a project in isolation. If you look at it, when we're trying to decide where are the most viable projects, sometimes it's a suite of projects. If you aren't trying to do a marsh creation because that's where you want to, you think you're going to get the most carbon sequestered there, you may need to couple that with some sort of a terrace or a barrier island project so that way you can mitigate some of the energy that may lead to that erosion. So I think it's looking at things in an integrated, holistic way is the way we're going to be able to address these projects and these challenges moving forward.
That is one of the better pitches I've heard for the CPRA's integrated coastal
And no, I'm not on
master
the
plan
payroll.
for a sustain. The full name is for the plan for a sustainable coast. Kimberly might know back there, but the CPRA's coastal master plan really is. If nobody's familiar with it, I encourage you to go just Google CPRA coastal master plan, and you're going to see it's a very holistic and integrated set of projects that really does consider all the different ways in which a coast needs to be restored. With that being our only question.
Well, let me just say one more thing about the master plan. So it's a plan that evolves over time. And so initially, it was every 5 years, now it's every 6 years. So as soon as the last version was released in 2023, they initially started working on the 2029 master plan. So we're in that process right now. And the reason why I bring it up is we're in the open solicitation period for new projects, ideas for projects to be incorporated into the coastal master plan. So you got another month or so to do that. So if you're thinking about areas that maybe you're thinking about from a carbon perspective, this is an opportunity to contribute to that state process of contributing project ideas that maybe then can be evaluated and figure out what those integrated benefits might be.
Absolutely. Yeah, so as we start moving, I understand that we might be the only thing standing between all of our participants and happy hour. So as we move to the end, Gary, what do you think is in for the future of the carbon market, of blue carbon, maybe even specifically? But where do you think we're going? What's next?
Well, I want to direct a question to Brian.
Uh-oh.
Ooh.
My mic's off now, right?
No. So, what is the coastal strategy in for coastlines and resilience without considering sea level rise?
I mean, so sea level rise is obviously a big part of what we're trying to evaluate, for where the projects are. So I guess can you just restate that?
I can speak to it a little bit. I'm on the lowly technical advisory team, but there are dozens of us across the state, stakeholders. But the beginning of the coastal master plan does kind of start with the low, medium, and high
Right.
sea level rise scenarios. And you're right. It's a difficult task because there's a range. There's a range of uncertainty.
Right.
When it comes to every project and whether it'll be impacted by sea level rise or whether it, or to what extent will it still be there and in what scenario. And that's just something that ultimately comes down to the policymakers, and it's just kind of a part of, it's such a large, robust, ongoing conversation that it's one part of it.
Well, the sea level rise estimates also continually get revised.
Absolutely.
You know, so I mean, any of the sea level rise estimates, the models globally that exist and then locally, those things are changing over time. As you get more data, you see that those trends they're not linear. They have peaks and valleys associated with those. And so I think that makes it challenging. But I mean, one of the things you have to do, and one of the reasons why these sorts of plans and other people are trying to emulate what's being done in Louisiana from that planning standpoint, it has to continually evolve, and it has to be modified based upon what the new information we have is. I mean, and when you're talking about, it's not just sea level, itself. You have changes that happen with climate. If we have changes in wind patterns, when all of a sudden, the things are moving, and we're now getting winds that are coming more out of the south on a more persistent basis, you're going to end up with more flooding, right? So your relative sea level rise is going to be higher than an area that's not getting that. Sea level, there's global or eustatic sea level rise. So how high is the water across the globe? And that's useful to know because that is rising. But what's really important for any of us, any place that you're located, was your relative sea level rise. How is the water rising where you are relative to what is land doing? Is land accreting or gaining elevation, or is it sinking? There's all sorts of things that contribute to that sinking or subsidence. And so, we're in an area here that has some of the highest rates of relative sea level rise on the planet. The other thing that you have to realize when you're talking about land loss is that, what is your gradation? If you go and look at, a place that has you've seen these pictures of Nova Scotia where they have these 30-foot tides, right? So at the beginning of the day, the boat's up here, and at the end of the day, the boat is down on the bottom, and it's got you need a staircase to get up to where land is. So when you have places that have very high gradations and elevation, when you increase the sea level, you're going to lose a little bit of land. Who's ever looked at any of our wetlands from the air? There's almost no gradation in elevation that's there. You can go 100 meters into that marsh, 300 feet. I have a hard time turning that scientific mind off. I apologize about that. And, you may see an elevation gain of a few inches. So if the sea rises a half a foot, you may lose hundreds of feet of marsh. Other places don't see that. So that's something you have to factor into how you're making these decisions. And also, every change that you do, every project you do, you have to look at what the impact is. There's a benefit localized to it, but, there are maybe some indirect impacts that happen, in another location. Anytime you change hydrology, the way water moves, it's going to have a benefit here, and it may have a detriment for something that happens over here. So you have to look at those things holistically. And I think that's where those integrated plans are important as we try to factor this into what those markets look like in terms of evaluating what a credit is and what was our definition of permanence. What does that mean?
And I want to interject for a second too and say, even if you're somebody who says, I don't think the sea's coming up at all. I mean, that's fine. We could, the sea
Come
could,
down to LUMCON.
the sea could come up not one more inch, and we would still have coastal land loss, right? Yeah. An evolving climate and coastal land loss in Louisiana are related but not codependent concepts. We need to fight back against coastal land loss, whether there's an inch of sea level rise or not.
Right. Yeah.
Gary?
Yeah, no, I was just making a pitch for carbon capture because there's a lot of opposition here in Louisiana on carbon capture. And do we have Class 6 well permanency here yet?
That we do. That's my department, the Department of Energy and Natural Resources.
Congratulations.
Well,
Okay.
yes, absolutely. That's my job as of Monday.
Okay.
Gary's going to be cornering you. So
Yeah. We'll be giving you a call. Anyway, you need all forms of technology and an approach to managing carbon to work together to make it work, to make it happen. And I really think that all countries need to work together to make it happen because you don't want runaway greenhouse gas, So,
I think that message of cooperation is a great one for us to close on. So thank you everyone for coming out today, and we'll get to that happy hour.
we used all of our time, too.
Yeah,
We got 15 seconds left to walk off the stage, so perfect.
Thank you all for joining for this session, and thank you all for joining the Tulane Future Energy Forum. Have a nice weekend.